Welcome, everyone. This is my Kings of Gondor tier list. I thought that'd be a fun idea, and I Google searched the YouTubes, and I didn't find anyone else who did this. So, at this time, this is a unique tier list. I don't know if tier lists are still the hip and hoppin' thing, but I thought this would be a fun idea. So, before we get into it, I have a list of notes with the exploits of the various kings of Gondor from the Legendarium of Tolkien. And I think it should be said that, well, obviously, I'm a huge Tolkien fan. I love Lord of the Rings. I've read the book. And I love the lore. Unfortunately, because Gondor is a fictional place with fictional kings, they do not have extensive biographies or lists of deeds like real-life kings would. So, like the majority of these kings, we don't know much about them. So I'm just gonna have to wade through it and kind of just talk it over and see how it pans out. I have let me just looking at some stuff. Anyway, so I'm gonna do my best to talk about these kings to the best of my knowledge and of all their various exploits and deeds and cool stuff. And, well, without any further ado, let's get started. Now, we're going to start. These pictures are a little tiny. They might be hard to see. We'll start with the first king of Gondor. Well, I'll talk about that. Elendil the Tall, whose name means star lover or devoted to the stars. He is the guy you may know if you've seen The Fellowship of the Ring. He's in the prologue. He's the king that gets struck down by Sauron when they assault Mordor. 3,000 years ago, Gandalf. Elendil the Tall was a Númenórean, as were a number of as were his sons. A Númenórean who was the son of Amandil, that is, the man devoted to Aman, who was Prince of Andune, I believe was his name. It was a city on the western edge of the island of Númenor. When the rest of the king of Númenor and his men turned away from the teachings of the elves and the Valar, the faithful, led by the Prince of Andune, stuck to those teachings, right? They kept the faith, so to speak. And for this, they were always suspected of treason and, held in contempt and disregarded. Maybe not disregarded, but they weren't liked. But when Ar-Pharazôn the Golden, the famous Númenórean king, was going to sail west and conquer Valinor, he was building his great fleet, the Great Armament, I believe it was called. Amandil sailed west to get help. I don't remember the story off the top of my head. I didn't write notes about these guys, about Númenor itself. But I believe Amandil sailed west to get help. In the meantime, he entrusted Elendil to lead the faithful. And I think he saw some sign, maybe it was a bird or something, I forget, that basically told Elendil help wasn't coming and Númenor would be lost. So he led the faithful, his men, along with his two sons, Isildur and Anarion, to east, to Middle-earth, to escape the encroaching doom of Númenor. And if you read the story, you know Númenor was sunk beneath the waves, and its great civilization lost. Elendil lands in Middle-earth, in the northern part, in the elf realm of Lindon, which is, I believe, ruled by Círdan the Shipwright, who rules Mithlond, the Grey Havens, which is where the Frodo, Bilbo, and Gandalf depart west at the end of the Return of the King. So there Elendil lands. He's greeted presumably by Círdan, and he leads the men on his ships into the heart of Eriador, which is the great western region of Middle-earth, where the Shire is by the end of the Third Age, and he founds the realm of Arnor, which is variously glossed as like I think it's like the royal land or another thing. He builds the city, his fortress of Anu Minas, in at the shores of Lake Evendim, where his seat is, and he becomes the High King of Arnor and Gondor, or the Dunedain, or the Dunedain realms in exile. I've seen different names, and that's his great founding of Arnor and the realms of the Dunedain. He begins the great lineage of the two kingdoms that will dominate Middle Earth, Western Middle Earth, anyway, for the Third Age. As you know from his... Maybe I should wave around the character to be more interesting. As you know from his epithet, Elendil the Tall, he was very tall. The sources I've seen have put him at like 7'11", which was tall for Numenorians, evidently. And Numenorians, of course, very tall. I should probably have mentioned, I'm getting all my information from the Tolkien Gateway website, which is a great resource, and they cite their sources. A lot of this information can be found in the appendices of Lord of the Rings, and some of the other stuff like the history of Middle Earth and other writings, the Silmarillion, which has the Akallabeth, the story of the downfall of Numenor. Elendil rules for a period of over 100 years. He is a Numenorean, he lives a long time. But they discover that Sauron, who had been the one to bend Ar-Pharazôn of Numenor's ear and lead to the downfall, had escaped. He wasn't destroyed in the cataclysm. He flees back to Mordor and begins building his strength. And about the end, it's the end of the Second Age. I forget the exact year. It's like 32 something or 34. I don't know the exact dates. I didn't write those down. But Sauron begins to kind of start attacking the Dunedain realms. He wants to destroy them, last for all. I guess he sees them as the only way to challenge his power. They attack Gondor, and so Elendil calls up his men, his soldiers, and he meets with Gil-galad, High King of the Noldor, who I believe is ruling in Rivendell, and he makes the last alliance of elves and men, and he co-leads it with Gil-galad. So they lead a great army, a great host, south into Mordor, and this is, again, the prologue to the Fellowship of the Ring. And there, they beat back Sauron's forces at the Battle of Dagorlad, which is where the Dead Marshes are. You know, the place where all the dead fellows, all the heads. It's creepy. And so, then they force themselves through the Black Gate, presumably, and they get to Sauron's fortress of Barad-dûr. It's a lot of history. I just kind of want to preface it. Elendil and Gil-galad fight Sauron together, which must have been quite an awesome sight. These two heroes of their respective people spar. They go toe-to-toe with the Dark Lord of Evil, with Sauron. They kill him, or at least they wound him. They like kill his mortal form, his body, whatever that's, because Sauron is immortal. He's an Ainu. So he can't really be killed, but his body can be wounded, and presumably that wounds his spirit in some capacity. And Gil-galad and Elendil do it, but at the expense of their own lives. So these three guys fighting beneath the Tower of Barad-dûr die. And with that, Elendil's career as a lord of Numenor, as the High King of the Dunedain, comes to an end. And he rules for about 121 years. So where does he belong on this chart? He's going to have to be S tier. I mean, he laid the foundations for his kingdoms. We don't have much information about, like, the governance and the institutions and all that stuff. You know, the famous, what was Aragorn's tax policy kind of quip. But, presumably, he laid very strong foundations for his successors. He created these two... excuse me. He created Arnor, and he oversaw the creation of Gondor. He ruled for over a century, presumably over a measure of peace and prosperity as the exiles rebuilt their lives. He probably made alliances with the local chieftains and the local people, establishing rule over there. He treated with the elves, had good relations with them, and he probably oversaw a period of great stability and peace before the last war, the War of the Last Alliance. That's an S tier. He's the founder of his realms, and he deserves to be remembered as a glorious, great hero of men, a great force for the good. And I mean, come on, he slayed Sauron with the help of Gil-galad, who was probably the mightiest elf of his time. So, I mean, that's no small feat. S tier for Elendil. All right, that was a long one, and we have like 36 kings to get through, so I can't be talking about them too much. But that set it up. Isildur is next. Isildur, again, from the prologue of the Fellowship of the Ring. He's the one who takes the ring from Sauron, but we'll get to that. He begins his career, his name means moon servant, by the way, just for fun fact. He begins his career living in Numenor. He is a Numenorian, and he is with his father, and presumably he helps prepare the exiles for their escape before Numenor is destroyed. Excuse me. Isildur manages to put on a disguise and sneak into the royal palace at Armenelos, which is the capital of Numenor, and steal a fruit from the white tree from Nimloth, I think, was the Numenorian white tree. Just like in later Third Age, you have the white tree growing in Gondor. He takes the fruit and he smuggles out. Apparently, he has a bit of a scuffle and he gets injured, but like the petals from the fruit or flower or whatever heal him on the spot. So he definitely gets points for that. Later, when the exiles flee Numenor, they have a number of ships. There might be an exact number, but I don't remember what it is. But Elendil's traveling with his guys, and Isildur and his brother Anarion are traveling in a separate portion of their ships. And I guess in the tumult of Numenor's demise, the ships are blown kind of off course. And Isildur and Anarion's ships go southwards, while Elendil's goes north to land in Lindon at the Grey Havens. Isildur and Anarion land at the mouths of the Anduin River. They sail up, and that later becomes the core of Gondor. And so Isildur founds the fortress of Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Moon, which is more famous as Minas Morgul at the entrance to Mordor, I guess as a means to watch over the Black Land. And him and his brother Anarion co-found Osgiliath. It's like built on the shores of the Anduin, probably on either side, and probably built on some islands around there, and it becomes, the seat of the new realm they create, Gondor. Isildur is also known to have made the pact with the king of the Men of the Mountains, I think they were. At the Halls of the Dead is in the Return of the King, where Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas go. In the book, along they go with some Dunedain riders, and apparently the king of these mountain men had sworn an oath to Isildur, probably something like an oath of fealty as king of Gondor, co-king. He co-ruled with Anarion, his brother, and of course the men of the mountain renege on their deal, and Isildur curses them. I don't know. First of all, I don't know what power he had to curse mortal men like that. He was a man himself. And second, I don't know when they refused the summons. It might have been during the War of the Last Alliance or sometime afterwards. I don't know. I don't remember. I didn't write the notes for that one. But Isildur leads troops along with his father and Gil-galad and his brother Anarion in to attack Mordor at the War of the Last Alliance. I already talked about that story. And after Sauron is defeated, Isildur cuts the ring from Sauron's finger. In the movie, he kind of like slashes the sword as because Sauron kills Elendil, and then he's moving towards Isildur. Isildur takes the broken sword Narsil and like cuts his fingers off. In the book, it seems to suggest Sauron had already been cast down, and Isildur just kind of like cut the ring from his corpse. But anyway, Isildur takes the ring, and he claims it as a weregild, as like a prize for the death of his father and his brother Anarion. We'll talk about him in a moment. Círdan and Elrond, who was there serving under Gil-galad, tell Isildur to destroy the ring, to cast it into the fires of Mount Doom. Cast it into the fire, Isildur! And Isildur, of course, says no, he keeps it. Now, in the book, it doesn't seem to be quite as sinister, and I don't know if he truly understood that the ring was evil. In the movie, it seems to present like the ring was already working its magic on him, its evil on him, and he couldn't throw it away. He didn't want to because it was too precious. It was his. So he keeps the ring as like an heirloom of his house, and he writes about it for a little bit. But now he is the sole ruler of Gondor and Arnor. He is now the new High King. And he goes to Gondor, kind of orders the realm. Now that his brother's dead, he puts his nephew Meneldil in charge of Gondor, as like, I guess, a regent or some kind of viceroy. And then he goes north, apparently to take counsel with Elrond. Along the way, he goes up the Anduin River, and he gets to a place called the Gladden Fields, where he's ambushed by orcs. And in the end, him and Isildur and 3 of his sons are slain at the Gladden Fields. The ring is lost. It floats into the river, later to be found by Sméagol, many centuries later. And that's it. That's Isildur's reign. He ruled for 123 years as King of Gondor, and later as the High King of Gondor and Arnor. Excuse me. And his descendants would later rule in Arnor, because his fourth and youngest son, I didn't write his name, I think it's Valandil, was a baby when Isildur went to war, and so he was left behind. Valandil later takes over Arnor, but he doesn't claim the rulership of Gondor. That is Isildur's career. So where does Isildur belong? This is an interesting question, because he had the ring. He could have destroyed it. If Isildur had destroyed the ring, right? If he had thrown it into the fires of Mount Doom, he could have been among the greatest heroes of Middle-earth. But he kept the ring. And because he kept the ring, Sauron's power was allowed to endure, and that would cause countless suffering and wars and bloodshed and all kinds of stuff, both for Gondor and other places beyond Gondor. But he kept the ring, and he had a reign of 123 years. He lived to be like 260. He had quite a career. And unfortunately, like the last 2 years, he kind of mucked some of it up. I can't put him in S tier. I gotta put him in A tier, because, I mean, besides keeping the ring, he did rule. He did found Gondor. He did steal the fruit from the white tree, plant it in it was either I think it was in Minas Ithil, his own fortress. That's where he put the tree. He put the tree somewhere, so that it would continue on. I mean, he probably ruled over a period of great peace, prosperity, stability. You know, he set up his kingdom the same way that Elendil did. He's an A tier. The one blemish on Isildur's record, and it's a big blemish, is he kept the One Ring. Next, we move on to Anarion, who was Isildur's brother and Elendil's second son. Again, he was a Númenorian, born in Númenor. He got on the ships. I don't think he has any deeds he did before leaving Númenor, like Isildur does with the White Fruit. But he, along with Isildur, land in Gondor, and they found Gondor, which I like etymology. So it means like the stone land, because I suppose because of the mountains, and they build lots of things out of stone. It's very fun. Anarion, which is probably means something like son of the sun, like son, male child of the sun, the big flaming ball in the sky. You know, because Isildur is the moon, Anarion is the sun. He founds Minas Anor, the future Minas Tirith, at the foot of the White Mountains. There's kind of like a symmetry. There's Minas Anor, Minas Ithil, and then in the middle there's Osgiliath, where the kings rule. Anarion suffers the attack from Sauron. I think Sauron attacks Gondor first, and that's what causes the alliance. I think I already mentioned that. And then Anarion goes with his brother and father, and they fight in Mordor. At the Siege of Barad-dûr, which apparently lasted like 7 years, Anarion is killed. Like the year before Sauron's defeat, Anarion is presumably observing his troops doing siegecraft, and he is struck by a falling rock. It hits him on his helmet, and it's apparently big enough that it dents his helmet up, and it kills him. It crushes his skull. And that is very sad, because Anarion was probably a very good king, like his brother and father. He ruled for 120 years, and that's I mean, he co-founded Gondor. He set up all the foundations for the kingdom, making him, he's definitely either S or A. Making him S tier, I don't think he quite does something to get S tier. He isn't recorded to have any great feats of battle or do any great things. I mean, he did build Minas Anor and Osgiliath and founded Gondor, but Isildur did much of that too. I'm gonna have to put him in A tier. We just don't know enough about him, and he is definitely overshadowed by his father and brother. I mean, he wasn't even in the movie. He wasn't even mentioned. The picture of him apparently comes from the trading card game here. So that's Anarion. I'm sorry to say he's only an A tier, but that's still pretty good because, hey, he is the first. It depends on how you count the kings, because Isildur was really, he was co-king of Gondor, and then he kind of moved towards more a king of Arnor before he died. Anarion was always a king in Gondor, so he's kind of like the first, maybe second king. It depends on how you count it. The first undisputed king of like Gondor, with nothing else attached to it, is Anarion's son Meneldil. Now here's a chance for me to talk about the art. So a lot of this I just found on Google, but these next sequence of kings I found on the Tolkien Gateway, usually the profile pictures for the various kings on their entries, and they seem to be mainly drawn by a man or a fellow by named Matej Cadil, who is I really like the little colored pencil drawings he does, and they are drawn, the kings of Gondor, like they're very Byzantine-inspired. They're a little hard to draw because the image is so small, but I mean, you know, the armor, the jewelry, like the crowns of the queens, is very like Theodosia. We'll get this king right here. We'll get over to him. His armor and his horse's armor are very much like Byzantine cataphracts. You know, just the enameled jewels and the robes. It's very Byzantine, and I think it's really cool because Tolkien always likened Gondor to kind of Byzantium, to the Rome of Numenor, kind of a successor that was lesser but still great in its own right. And the movies took a little bit of artistic inspiration from the Byzantines when they represented Gondor. So, on to Meneldil. Meneldil, meaning like something like heaven lover or astronomer in a more idiomatic English, was Anarion's son. He was the last man born on Numenor, according to the sources. As in, he was a baby. He was like 1 year old when he had to flee Numenor. So he was technically a Numenorian in the sense he was from the island, but he wouldn't have grown up on it. He wouldn't have known anything about it. His brother, or his father and uncle, were already like 100 years old by the time they left Numenor. So they knew a bit about it. Meneldil stayed, so by the time his father and uncle and grandfather went to war, Meneldil was already an adult, as they ruled for like 120 years, so he was already man-grown. But he apparently stayed behind, I guess, to look after Gondor. And when Isildur returned, he made Meneldil, I guess, the regent or viceroy of Gondor. He's said to have committed the rule of Gondor to Meneldil, I guess in Isildur's stead. Isildur dies, and because Isildur's son and heir Valandil, I think it is, he's like 14 when he succeeds to the throne of Arnor. He doesn't press his claim as the High King of both, and I guess him and his regent and whatever other institutions there are focus on Arnor, while Meneldil kind of creates Gondor. Well, maybe not creates is the right word, but he stays in Gondor and he rules Gondor, and there seems to be a sense that he didn't much like Isildur's overlordship, or he kind of chafed under Isildur's supervision. So he was kind of happy when Isildur left Gondor. Isildur dies, and now Meneldil, I guess, asserts the independence of Gondor. He ruled for 156 years, Meneldil. So where does he belong? He's really kind of like the first true king of Gondor as an independent sovereign realm. And we don't know much about what he did. It was presumably peaceful. It was probably uneventful. He might have just kind of restored the kingdom after the loss of like its founders and these great heroes and the shocks it had after the war. So he probably spent a lot of time rebuilding it. So where does Meneldil sit? That's a good question. So Meneldil probably has only one major flaw that we can attribute to him with the benefit of hindsight in the story, is that he broke the unity of Arnor and Gondor. At least in some... he had a role in it. And again, Tolkien didn't write an exhaustive treatment about all the conditions and the intrigues that were going on there. So it's unknown how much of the partition of the Dunedain realms was Meneldil's fault. How much would have just happened because of, their geographical distance, their differences in climate, maybe even culture, economic factors. Who knows? We can't say for certain. I think we can say that Meneldil had to pick up the pieces after his father's death, and he seems to have done that fine. So I think I'm going to give him a B tier, because the realms did get partitioned, but he probably did pretty well with his portion that he got. So, yeah, B tier for Meneldil. The third king, or fourth, whatever you want to call it, the next one is Kemendor, the Earth Servant, who is the son of Meneldil. He is said to have had a peaceful reign of 80 years. Almost about half of his father's reign. Which is, just a regular reign. But Kemendor isn't really said to have done anything. Uneventful, peaceful. Middle of the road. He probably just built on the foundation his father left him. Probably ruled well. Didn't really do anything major. Probably built some roads or some forts or something. Defended the borders as needed. We don't have much about Gondor law and Gondor rights and Gondor much. I mean, there's role-playing guys that come up with that stuff, but Kemendor, I suppose is a B tier. B tier is a fine king, constrained by the fact we just don't know. Earendil was Kemendor's son, the sea lover. Earendil, named after his distant ancestor Eärendil, the half-elf. Again, not much known. Ruled for about 86 years. Probably oversaw expansion of economy. Gondor probably might have even still been recovering in some capacity from the war. Or maybe it had already recovered and was experiencing prosperity. So, B tier. I hope this isn't just going to be all B tiers. All they just did the B tiers. Next is Anardil, the lover of the sun, as in the the orb in the sky. Again, don't know much about it. Ruled 87 years. That's a B tier. He probably, you know, kept his kept his thing, his court in top shape and ruled. Yeah. Next is Ostaher, the City Lord, which is a cool title. Ostaher was he was the king of Gondor. He is said to have rebuilt and enlarged Minas Anor. His little picture has him with little building stones. And he also spent the summers residing in Minas Anor, which would later become the seat of the Gondorian kings, as Osgiliath was abandoned for a number of reasons, which we'll get to. He is known for the first invasion of Gondor by the Easterlings, at least the first one we know about. But he was unfortunately too old to fight them. His 81-year reign was kind of just ended by it concluded with those invasions. He probably benefited from a prosperous realm because he did construction projects, all the wealth to invest in that, and he did have to deal with the Easterlings. And the Easterlings didn't destroy his kingdom, but that was apparently more to do with his son, who we'll get to. I'm gonna have to give him a B tier for Ostaher, the City Lord, just because he probably wasn't any better or worse than any of these others. Next one will be more interesting. Romendakil, excuse my Quenya. Romendakil the First, the East Conqueror of the East, who was the son of Ostaher. His birth name was Tarostar, something like the Lord of the Land, or some other thing like that. He, during his father's reign, during the end of it, when the Easterlings invaded, he led forces and defeated the Easterlings. And that's how he got his name. He apparently was really good at that, and he continued to fight them during his 49-year reign. He, unfortunately, fought against the Easterlings and was killed in battle. The first Gondorian king since Anarion to have been killed. Well, maybe Isildur, because Isildur died after Anarion. Yeah, since Isildur to have died in battle. And which is unfortunate. We don't know anything about his domestic policy or really what kind of king he was. Besides, he was just a good fighter. That is gonna get me I'm gonna give him a B tier. Oh, yeah, B tier. Because if he was A tier, he wouldn't have been killed in battle, right? C tier. He did fight the Easterlings and win for a while, so he's not C tier, but he is B tier because he died in battle, which I think it happens. But a king's job is, one, to protect the realm, of course, but to rule it. And if the king dies in battle, he can't fulfill that obligation, and the realm suffers from that, especially in the chaos. He probably died fairly young for a Gondorian. So, yeah, B tier. His son, Turambar, Master of Doom, who shares the epithet with Turin Turambar from the Silmarillion, which was a very, very, very distant relative. I think Hurin was his cousin, and Hurin was one of the ancestors of the kings of Numenor and Gondor. Turambar avenged his father by fighting the Easterlings, probably destroyed them, and conquered territories in Rhûn. This little picture of him has him holding a map of the Sea of Rhûn, of Rovanion, and then the right side of the map is the Sea of Rhûn. So he is probably the first king since Isildur and Anarion to really embark on a period of expansion for Gondor, to kind of securing these frontiers and pacifying its neighbors in expeditions and stuff like that. That is an A for me. He is enjoying Gondor at a high point of its power and wealth. He has the resources to go and defeat his enemies, and he expands the realm. I always love a good conquering king. And he doesn't die in battle. That's good. His son was Atanatar, father of men, Atanatar the First, who is shown here with an unknown queen. As far as I know, he wasn't given a specific queen that he lived with, but his realm was said to be uneventful for 81 years. I forgot to list the reign. Yeah, Tarambor reigned for 126 years. Quite an achievement. His son only 82 years. 81. Misreading my notes. But uneventful, much like the other kings before him. That's a B tier. I don't think we need to justify it much more. Siriondil, lover of the Sirion, which presumably refers to the river of Beleriand, which drowned at the end of the First Age, was Atanatar the First's son. He apparently was king. He was king for about 82 years, and according to my notes, he oversaw expansion undertaken by his son, Taranon Falastor. We'll get to him. Taranon was like a mariner. He liked to go around, and he would conquer and expand across the coast. Some of this happened under Siriondil's reign. So that would mean that although he did not participate, he definitely provided the resources, and then he had to order the land that was occupied, so that offers some measure of skill and ruling. I think that is an A tier, another expansion-oriented king. It's hard to say how much of it was his son's doing, how much of his, but he was king. I imagine he did kind of order and organize the land that his son conquered. Next is Taranon Falastor. His first name means like the high gates, and his epithet is the Lord of the Coasts. He is known as the first of the Ship King, son of Siriondil, I believe is what it is. Again, he liked to go around. He expanded Gondor along the coasts. He presumably liked to build ships. He built fleets. He conquered. He expanded and probably subjugated peoples. He married Beruthiel, who is the famous queen. She's mentioned in The Lord of the Rings. You know, she had these cats who people thought went around and spied on people. Beruthiel was from Umbar, or somewhere around Umbar. She was a black Númenorian, who were the descendants of the king's men from Númenor who settled in Umbar, far to the south. They were not friendly to Gondor, and Beruthiel's marriage with Taranon was probably a political alliance to secure some kind of peace. And in that regard, I don't know how successful that was, just because it's not mentioned. But their marriage was cold, and he didn't like Beruthiel. Beruthiel hated the sea, which was ironic for a man known as the Lord of Coasts. And he eventually had her cast on a boat out to sea. I guess he was just done with her. He couldn't put up with her little shenanigans anymore. But because of that, he died heirless after 83 years. He never had a child with Beruthiel, which that's going to knock him down a tier. An expansionist king, a ship king, who are known as some of the greatest kings of Gondorian history. That would be A, maybe an S, maybe not S, definitely A. But he did not have an heir, which I think is a gross breach in the king's kind of obligation to provide for the succession, because in a monarchy you need to make sure that there is a succession, that somebody will take the throne and it will not be unclear or disputed and lead to civil war. He didn't do that. He's like Basil II in that regard, because Basil II was like a great emperor in all regards, except he never had a son, because he was like a celibate warrior, and that kind of led to the downfall of his dynasty and a weakening of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. I like to call it the Roman Empire. So yeah, B tier, for Taranon Falastor, but for different reasons than the rest of them. I need to stress that. Next up is Earnil, which seems to be a contracted form of Earendil. Earendil. He is the first of that name, means sea lover. He was Taranon Falastor's nephew. He was the son of his brother, Prince Tarkirion, which means like ship lord. He would be the second ship king, Earnil the first, and he continued expansions along the coast. He built a great navy, repaired the harbors, really built up the Gondorian navy capacity, all that cool stuff. And he's known for conquering Umbar, which was the great realm to the south, the kind of the third realm of exile of the Númenóreans. And Umbar would always be a thorn in Gondor's side. And I guess when Taranon divorced Beruthiel, the Umbarians weren't happy with that, so his nephew, Earnil, had to deal with them. This little picture shows him presumably in Umbar, kind of planting the flag, the banner of Gondor as its conqueror. He, a great conqueror. Who doesn't love a great conqueror? Unfortunately, he only ruled for 23 years, which is very short as Númenóreans go. It would be a fairly decent reign from our point of view in real world, but for Gondorians who reigned like upwards of 80 years, it's kind of short because he was lost at sea, presumably on one of his expeditions. Where he was going, who knows? Maybe he was going to the far south to conquer those lands or whatever. And so, in a similar vein to Romendikil I, he got himself killed. He died on expedition. And as the king, that has a twinge of irresponsibility to it. But he did conquer Umbar, which would be a very important event for the future dominance of Gondor. So, gosh, this is a tough choice. A or B? A or B? You know what? I'm going to just have to go A, because though his reign was short, he did expand he did expand Gondor, and probably dealt with the only rival who could challenge its dominance at sea or land, like as a single power. Presumably, we don't know much about Umbar, besides like where it is, and that it was a site of where Númenóreans went. So I'm gonna make him A tier, just because of it was such a good achievement. Next, I am going to yes, my notes. Earnil's son, Kiryandil, the ship lover is his name, was the third ship king, and his father captured Umbar, and it was up to Kiryandil to defend it from Haradrim and the Black Númenóreans, as in the Númenóreans descended from the exiles who landed in Umbar. They were called Black Númenóreans, as like the wicked, the evil Númenóreans. I mean, the stories are written from a Gondorian elvish perspective. We don't know what the Black Númenóreans called themselves or how they thought of themselves, but it's fiction. Unfortunately, Kiryandil was always fighting in Umbar against the people trying to take it back, and he eventually was slain. After 79 years on the throne, he was killed in Umbar. Or in Harad, exactly where, it's not really specified. That, for me, is going to get him a B tier. Again, he had to hold on to Umbar, and he did for a while, but he was eventually done in. He built ships, probably presided over a powerful navy, but he got killed, and I think by now I don't like kings. I don't like it when kings let themselves be killed in battle. Next is Hjarmendikil the First. This guy, his name means the South Conqueror. He was the son of Kiryandil, he was born Kiryahir, which is something like Lord of Ships, which is a cool name. He was the fourth and last of the ship kings, and he had to pick up the pieces after his father died or was killed. He is said to reorganize the armies of Gondor. Exactly what this meant, who knows? He might have just like rallied them, or he might have actually reorganized them on a structural level. And then he took them and he conquered Harad. He destroyed the enemies. He brought all Gondor to its greatest extent. So he expanded probably into like Enedwaith, the lands to the west that connect to Arnor. Might have even brought the borders up to Tharbad on the river Greyflood. And he definitely went east into Harad, or Rhûn, south into Harad. He subjugated peoples there, and he even set up the watch over Mordor, which is important. He would ensure that Sauron or his successors couldn't gather strength in Mordor. He presides over Gondor's golden age. This is its greatest extent. This is like Basil II of the Byzantines. He has brought the empire to its apogee, that its apex. This is as great as Gondor will ever be. He probably ruled well. He probably founded some strong institutions, kept the borders secure, defeated his enemies, subjugated them. You can see in this picture, just barely, he's standing over a number of kneeling southern rulers who are presumably swearing fealty to him or surrendering their arms and their treasure to him. This is probably the greatest king of Gondor since Elendil and his sons, and until Aragorn later, who's you probably seen is over here. How do I rank Hiarmendikil the First? It's tempting to put him in A, because the only guy I have an S tier is Elendil. And because Elendil is an S tier, it seems like it's a special position that only Elendil can have, or Aragorn. But Hiarmendikil's achievements, I think, are better than these guys. So, you know what? Hiarmendikil the First is an S tier. Probably the greatest Gondorian king since the founders and until Aragorn. So, how do you follow Hiarmendikil? Well, with his son, Atenatar II. The Al-Karin is his epithet, means the glorious, and his name means, of course, father of men. He is said to have ruled in great peace and prosperity. He likely inherited a very wealthy realm. And was it him that it said that children played with precious stones like they were just rocks because they were so plentiful? Probably did great trade with the dwarves and the elves and all that stuff. He presided over a very large, wealthy, powerful realm. And unfortunately, he decided to neglect some aspects of it. One of the things he neglected was the Mordor Watch. I guess he laxed on it. Maybe he didn't want to pay for the extra soldiers. Who knows? He put them to work elsewhere. But he, just like the old adage, the land provided plenty and the people grew fat. And Atenatar II probably grew fat, and he was lazy because he could afford to be, because Gondor was so wealthy. And the institutions set in place by the previous kings probably allowed him to be lazy like this. Unlike his father, who ruled for 134 years, I forgot to mention, Atenatar II ruled for 77, and that reign was probably fine. People probably prospered, all that stuff. But as a king, not much happened under his reign. But he didn't do much. And it's difficult to know if a king reigning in times of plenty, what should he do, right? He doesn't have any great crises to fight against. He has no great enemies to overthrow. He's just steering the ship. And he's written as have to neglected. So we don't know exactly. Again, we don't have extensive biographies of these fictional guys. So mm, I'm gonna have to put him in a C. Our first C tier king, because he began to neglect. He neglected his station. Maybe he could afford to. Maybe he didn't need him so much. But I think the roots of Gondor's decline are beginning to show. Next is his son Narmakil, the Sword of Fire, which is such a cool title. He was also indolent. He really didn't want to rule. He probably pleasured himself with food and wine and entertainment and maybe even women, because he made his nephew Minalcar, which is like oh, I didn't even write down the it's like the tower helm. So maybe he was a member of the Fountain Guard or something. But his nephew Minalcar was made regent pretty early on in Narmakil's reign. Well, Narmakil just kind of went off. And all the eventful stuff that happened under Narmakil's reign was due to his nephew, which I suppose is the one important, like the one credit to Narmakil's reign, as he put a very capable man in charge of the kingdom, even if he didn't want to be that man. And I do not appreciate indolent kings like this. He's a D tier. The only reason he's not F is because his nephew. He put his nephew in charge. His nephew knew what he was doing, and he's not a C tier because, unlike his father Atanatar II, he actively just didn't want to deal with being king. He wanted all the the privileges and the wealth, but he didn't want to actually do the work. His father did the work sometimes, apparently, but he still was king. So yeah, D tier for Narmakil. Kalmakil, the Sword of Light, was Narmakil's brother, the father of Minalcar, and by the time, after his brother's reign of 68 years, Kalmakil was already old, and he only ruled for 10 years, and because he was so old, he left his son, Minalcar, in charge as regent. So, where does he belong? See in this picture, he's all old. He's a C tier. He didn't do anything, and he was too old to really do anything as king. Who knows if he would have done it had he come to the throne 10, 20, 50 years earlier. He's a C tier. He's just there. He doesn't do anything, and it's not really clear that he would have done anything. And in fact, he might have even been as bad as his own brother. But we'll put him with his father, Atanatar II, just because he didn't seem to do anything. Now, this next one, 18. What's listed 18? Romendikil II, the East Conqueror, who shares the title with the first Romendikil. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to mention, looking at my notes, Narmakil, who's down here, also deserves to be D tier because he died heirless. So, all that pleasure, and he never bothered to make a son. So, you belong in D. I'd put you in F, but your nephew saved it from you. I imagine that's not the only thing he saved you from. His nephew, Minalcar, back to him, Romendikil II, was another great king. The first great king since his ancestor, Hyarmendikil I. Romendikil II fought Easterlings as far as the eastern Sea of Rhun during his regency. So he was regent for quite a while. He fortified the western bank of the Anduin as a means to secure, so he's being very proactive in his defensive strategies. And as a show of the boundaries of Gondor, the power of the kingdom, and just a show of his wealth and his ability to do this, he built the Pillars of the Argonath, which you remember from the Fellowship of the Ring. In the Fellowship of the Ring, they pass by him, and they're the two kings with their hands outstretched, and they're holding swords, and they're supposed to be Elendil and Isildur. In the Tolkien stories, they're actually Anarion and Isildur, and instead of swords, they're holding axes, but they still have that outstretched gesture. And that is supposed to be the northern border of Gondor. That is where, the savage lands to the north end and Gondor civilization, power, and wealth begin. by the time the Fellowship passes by them, Gondor's borders have long retreated further south. Romendikil II also enlisted Northmen living in Rovanion into his armies. Now, what kind of situation, we don't know. Is it like Roman auxiliaries or Roman foederati, or he just enlisted them in the soldiers and then they would assimilate into Gondorian culture? These kind of things aren't concerned in the stories. But he definitely forged alliances with the Northmen, and he did this. One way was sending his son Valakar to King Vidugavia of Rovanion to, be an ambassador, to increase relations with them and all that stuff. We'll talk about Valakar. He'll be the next king. So, it isn't noticed that he really expanded, but Romendikil definitely kept the borders even when his indolent uncle and later father were unwilling or unable to do so. And because he was regent for so long, he ruled in his own right for 62 years, but he basically was in charge of Gondor for 126. Good, healthy, long reign. And you can see this picture, he's dressed up like a Byzantine cataphract. I really think that's cool. In the background, presumably, is Viduvagia, the Northman king. He's an A. He's an A king. He's not quite up to the exploits of Hiarmendikil I, but he is an A. He's a good king, and what will follow next is unfortunate, because that is the reign of Valakar. Well, Valakar's reign isn't so unfortunate yet. His name means the Vala helm, the Vala as in the angels of Middle-earth. And he was Romendikil II's son, who lived with Viguvagia for a while, and he fell in love with his daughter, Vidumavi, who, when Valakar was recalled back to Gondor at some point, he brought his wife with him. And this caused a bit of a scandal, right? So, up to this point, the Gondorians were very conscious about their Númenórean heritage, I guess the ruling elite of Gondor. And seeing a crown prince wed a Northman, a North woman, one of the middlemen, as the Gondorians, called patronizingly people who weren't of high Númenórean blood, this was kind of scandalous. This was not something that was allowed. I don't even know if it was allowed or disallowed, but it certainly wasn't looked upon favorably. One reason is probably just because of a sense that the Númenóreans were higher, they were different, and they were above the people that they ruled. And mixing the two was not something that was done. It would not do for the nobility. And two, the Númenóreans were afraid, the Gondorians were afraid that by wedding a lesser woman, right, this would dilute the blood of the Númenórean king, of the Númenórean royal house, and the king would have less lifespan. He'd have less majesty, less strength of mind and skill, and all that stuff that comes with being a Númenórean. And some people didn't like this. And maybe we can only speculate. Maybe there's a sense that if a North woman were to become Queen of Gondor, what would that mean for the lesser men in the kingdom? Would they be raised up too? And maybe the Númenórean nobility didn't like that prospect. Now, of course, Vidumavi, the future Queen of Gondor, was a princess. She was the daughter of a king, but daughter of what? Some lesser lordling in the wilds to the east? Come on. So, this caused quite a stir, and towards the end of his reign, Valakar suffered rebellions and riots and protests and all kinds. Probably some intrigues too, as his time was coming up. So his son, the Eldacar, the future Eldacar, would take over, and these anxieties that the Gondorians had were like they were starting to realize, oh no, it's going to happen soon. So they did a number of stuff, and that plagued Valakar's reign. This lasted 60. His reign lasted 66 years. So where do I put him? He didn't seem to do the great martial exploits of his father. He did well as an ambassador to the Northmen, maybe a little too well. How do I rank him? Because I'm living in the 21st century, right? And a marriage of the kind of Valakar and Vidumavi is not something that we would really bat an eye at. It's just a thing, right? It's just a marriage. But I will try to put myself into Middle-earth, Third Age Gondor and see to it from what Valakar knew should be done. Valakar probably understood on some level that he should have married a Gondorian noblewoman in some capacity. And I'll give him kudos for marrying someone he loved, or maybe he married her because he thought it would benefit the kingdom. I think he really doesn't have any deeds as king recorded, so we don't know how he ruled. But I think Valakar knowingly and a bit irresponsibly destabilized the realm by choosing his bride. And when you're a king, or at this point he was a prince, you kind of have to live, from what I understand, you kind of have to live on different expectations and different understanding of your place. You are not living for you so much as you are living for the health and safety of the realm. And he didn't do that when he married the woman. Now, he probably could have been a very good king, but he made a blunder, and I think that'll put him in... I don't think I want to put him in C tier, just because C is like... I don't think he's a C tier guy. He's a B tier. He's a B tier. His son, Eldacar, the Elfhelm, who was born Vinitharya, was a half Northman. He was the son of Valakar and his North woman wife. And when he came to the throne, he was immediately beset by the Kinstrife, which was a devastating civil war. And in the civil war, Osgiliath was sieged and captured and presumably destroyed by Castamir and his men. It was sacked, even if it wasn't like obliterated. Probably lots of people died, and the civil war was terrible. And Castamir manages to depose Eldacar and kills his son and heir, Ornendil. And then Eldacar flees north to presumably the court of his grandfather, Viduvegia, if Viduvegia was still alive, which is, actually, now that I think about it, probably not the case. But he went to the Northmen, gave their help, or asked for their help, along with a number of followers, loyalists that went with Eldacar. And then they returned after 10 years and fought Eldacar in the Kinstrife. Civil war. He kills Castamir. Eldacar fights Castamir. He kills Castamir at the crossings of the Eri River, which is just south of Minas Anor, Minas Tirith. And he takes over the throne. In the chaos, of course, Castamir's two sons, who I don't remember their names, I don't think I wrote them down, they flee to Umbar and establish their own splinter successor kingdom that breaks away. And so, under Eldacar's reign, Gondor loses control of Umbar. Umbar becomes independent. So, how do I rank Eldacar? He was, through no fault of his own, saddled with a civil war that was precipitated by both the irresponsible actions of his father and the ambition of probably many Gondorian lords and Castamere. And he is deposed and has to suffer the slaughter. But he later gathers his strength and returns and takes back the throne, and Gondor is shaken by the kinstrife. It's written about like the best blood of Gondor is lost in this war. So probably the great centers of population, fields are burned, cities are sacked, people die from starvation, from death, disease, probably all that kind of stuff. The borders of Gondor are shaken. The economic base is weakened, and so the resources of the kingdom are damaged. Eldacar has to then take the throne and start rebuilding. And from what I see, he did that. He did that fairly well. And he probably couldn't take back Umbar. But that was a difficult task for even who was the king that took Umbar in the first place? Eärnil I. And he was working with a wealthy, strong kingdom that had not just suffered a terrible civil war. So I will not hold that against Eldacar. So Eldacar gets a... He's an A. He's an A. Just like his grandfather, Romendikil II. He managed to take a bad situation and make the most of it. He defeated his enemies, and he pulled the kingdom out of the brink of oblivion. Now, because Osgiliath was destroyed, I think he withdrew to Minas Anor, to Minas Anor to rule, because Osgiliath was abandoned. Well, I assume there were people still there, but it was no longer the seat of the king. Eldacar gets an A tier, and the ironic thing is, one of the concerns, I'm sure in fictional Middle-earth land, there were a whole host of factors, and fictional Gondorian historians wrote huge books about what caused the kinstrife, and they list like 20 different reasons, and people debate about it or whatever. But one of the reasons was the fear that the king's lifespan would be diminished because he was half Northman. Well, it was not. He lived to be like 240 years or so. He lived to be over 200, and he reigned for about 48 years from when he ascended the throne and was deposed, and then from then on to his death. 48 years. Now this next one, Castamere the Usurper. We already talked about. His name means Jewel Helm. He was a cousin of Eldacar. I think it was Romendikil, or Romendikil had a second son, who I didn't write down, and a descendant was Castamere. Castamere was definitely a member of the royal house, and he used the question of legitimacy for Eldacar and the anxieties over his succession to his advantage. And whether he seems to have joined the rebellions that occurred because of Eldacar's heritage. It doesn't seem Castamere created it. He might have stoked the fires, then joined in when they were looking for a true-blooded member of the royal household, and he took advantage of that. And he deposed Eldacar and sacked Osgiliath. And he killed his relative, which would be like his other cousin, Ornendil, to get rid of the succession, which is, pretty cruel. I mean, it's not unheard of, but it's pretty cruel. Your own family, and you could argue that he did a lot of rash actions to make sure that the war was over quickly. But according to the sources, he is recorded as a cruel tyrant. He was not a good guy, and he managed to alienate probably every one of his supporters, or at least many of them, who didn't have something to gain from him being in power, which is probably what helped Eldacar beat him. Castamere attempted to move the capital to Pelargir because it's written that his support was along the coast of Belfalas and along the Anduin River, where Pelagir is. Probably because that's where like the high Numenorians settled in the greatest numbers, and that probably is where like the strongest. Yeah, so that they would have had the most interest in keeping the high Numenorian blood and status quo, in place. And I'm sure Castamir thought that was a sound move to relocate to where his supporters were more numerous. This managed to alienate probably a large portion of people around Minas Anor, because that's, they had been, everything was oriented to serve the seat of the king there, and if it moves, then they're kind of left out in the cold. So that probably contributed to Eldakar's victory over him, and of course Castamir was killed at the crossings of the Arrowy. His sons escaped to Umbar, where they bedevil the Gondorians for some time afterwards. But Castamir only reigned for 10 years as usurper. Castamir is an F tier. His actions directly led to the Kinstrife, or they didn't help it. And the Kinstrife was a terrible, awful event for Gondor. And that's, what else can I say? Awful king. Worst king of Gondor ever. Okay. So, after Castamir was Eldakar's son, well, after Castamir was Eldakar. Eldakar dies, and his son Aldemir, the Tree Jewel, comes to the throne. Under his reign, Harad rebels, presumably because Umbar is now independent, and Umbar is probably either funding or stoking Haradrim rebels and all that stuff. Aldemir goes south to fight the Haradrim and Umbar, and unfortunately he is slain. He rules for 50 years, and by the end of those 50 years, he is killed on the field of battle in Harad. That's a C tier. He was unfortunately not able to stem the decline of Gondor, and he lost his life when he tried to. That is unfortunate, but he's a C tier because he lost his life fighting, and yeah, there's no great songs for Aldemir, no great deeds. He was not his father. Aldemir was a weak king when Gondor needed a great king, but it would get one with Hiarmendikil II, who was born Vignarion, which means like the first something. The South Conqueror, Hiarmendikil II, named after his ancestor. I can't do the math of how many generations that's back. That's like 9 kings, but earlier. He was he comes to the throne after Aldemir's death, and he fights the Haradrim and defeats him. He avenges his father's death, and he defeats him. It's not recorded whether he like reasserts Gondorian control or he just defeats him but lets him be, focusing his resources on something elsewhere. But he reigns for 81 years. Honestly, this is an interesting choice. Normally I put him in A tier, but he doesn't seem to do anything other than defeat the Haradrim, which might have just like been at the beginning of his reign, and then he kind of settled. So probably a B tier for Hiarmendikil II. He has a cool picture. He looks like a Orthodox saint in this picture, and I really like it. His son was Menardil, the Tower Friend. He is important because he appoints his distant kinsman, Hurin, what did my notes say? Hurin of Emin Arnon. He appoints him steward of Gondor. Now this man's important because he is the ancestor of all the other stewards of Gondor leading up to Denethor II and Boromir and Faramir. He, therefore, puts in place that family that will rule Gondor for like the next 1,000 years once the kings are no more. Other than this, he goes trying to raid what does he do? He goes trying to raid. No, he doesn't raid. The Castamirids, the sons of, I think these like grandsons of Castamir, Angamaite and Sangahyando. Not sure what those names are, if they're even Quenya or Sindarin. I don't think so. They lead a raid. They are like grandsons of Castamir. They lead a raid at Pelargir, and Menardil goes to stop them. He fails. He is killed in this raid. Or he was inspecting the raid and they ambushed him. I think that's the story. You can check, I suppose. He only rules for 13 years, and it ends with him being killed. He's... The only thing saving him from D tier is that he did appoint the future steward. He did appoint the steward who would become the new, who would rule Gondor. Next is Telemnar, the Silver Fire, which is a cool name. He was Menardil's son, and he tries, this poor guy, he tries to build a fleet to take Umbar. He's working on it. And then, out of the blue, from nowhere, the Great Plague strikes. Now, according to the sources, it's suggested highly that the Great Plague was like created or at least sent by Sauron, who was by now gaining his strength back, and this Great Plague was there to weaken Gondor and the Middle Earth in general, and it does. Like huge amounts of people die. It's kind of like the Black Plague in European history. Like in some places, more than half the people just die to this disease, and Gondor is no exception. Whole regions of it become depopulated, which, after the War of the Kinstrife, weakens Gondor even further. Excuse me. And unfortunately, Telemnar dies, along with his children. His family, his children, and him succumb to the plague. The tree, the white tree, dies, which is just sad. Osgiliath begins to fall to ruins. There's nobody to repair it. The economic base is probably highly damaged. The soldiers are manpower is shrinking for soldiers. It's just not a good time in Gondor. And they need the troops elsewhere, and they withdraw from Mordor. The watch over Mordor ends, and this is probably exactly what Sauron wanted. And Telemnar rules for 2 years. I'm going to give him a C tier. He had such a short reign, we don't know how his expedition against Umbar would have gone. It very likely could have failed, but we don't know. He's got a C tier simply just because he was there. He didn't even get to rule much. You know what? No, we'll keep him as a C tier. He just, unfortunately, we'll never get to know what Telemnar could have been. His nephew was the son of Telemnar's brother, Prince Minastan. Succeeds. Tarandor means King of Stones. He is the one that relocates the capital to Minas Anor. So I think I said that about Eldacar before. Maybe he just hung out in Minas Anor a lot, but stayed in Osgiliath. Osgiliath is probably pretty much abandoned at this point under Tarandor's reign. He withdraws to Minas Anor, and he plants a white tree seedling there that becomes the white tree that we know from the movie. Or does it? No, that's like the third one. I don't think it's that one. A steward would later plant that one, but that's beyond what we're talking about here. Again, Gondor suffers great depopulation, but hold on, let me move my notes. Telemnar helms the ship, and he rules for 162 years, which is the longest reign of any king of Gondor. Unfortunately, we don't know much about other things he did, but again, like some of these other guys, he had to steer the ship after it was all broken and ruined and depopulated. And he seems to have done a fairly good job. I think a lesser king would have let Gondor fall apart, but he did not. And I think that's an A tier. He's probably exactly what Gondor needed at the time, even if he could not expand, the realm. He kept it going. That's an A tier. Next is his son, Telumechtar Umbardakil, which means the Sky Warrior, which is the Quenya term for Orion, the constellation Orion, and of course the conqueror of Umbardakil. He conquered Umbar and killed the last of Castemir's dynasty. And for that, this is, I think, Umbar was always the most important strategic objective in Gondorian foreign policy. If it could not be neutralized, like with Falastor here, then it had to be conquered, and that's what Umbardakil did. He is really not recorded doing much of anything else. He reigned for 52 years. So, Umbardakil, you're an A tier, along with your dad. After Umbardakil, you have Narmakil II, whose name, of course, means sword of fire, like that one. Yes, that's Narmakil I. Narmakil II was king when the Wain riders, which were Easterlings riding these big old carts. Wain is an old-timey way to say cart. Or not a cart, a wagon. Four-wheeled wagons. They attacked in chariots and wains, and must have been quite something to behold. But under his reign they attack, and unfortunately he is killed at the Battle of the Plains, south of Mirkwood, somewhere around Daggerlad, in the east, to the east of the Anduin River. And his death prompts, I guess, Gondor to finally retreat west to the western bank of the Anduin. So they effectively abandoned Ithilien, which probably had been one of the core regions of Gondor, but it just became too dangerous, too hot. Unfortunately, Narmakil only reigns 6 years, and at the end he gets killed. I'm going to have to give him a D tier. He very likely, if he had died like Tel-Ebnar did before he went and attacked the Wain Riders, he could be a C. But he went and he died, and he lost and he died, and that's a D tier. Yeah. He could have just retreated across the Anduin and stayed there, and the Wind Riders would have had to respond, but instead he went to go fight them, and I don't think Gondor at this particular time had the strength to do so. At least not under him. So, yeah. Kalimektar was his son, the Light Warrior. He managed to defeat the Wain Riders with Marhuini, who was a lord of the Northmen. So evidently Gondor renewed or kept their alliance with the Northmen. And Kalimektar built the White Tower in Minas Anor. The White Tower, the big old fancy tower from the movie. He reigned for 80 years, defeating the Wain Riders, building a White Tower. I think that's a B tier. Good king, good solid king. The realm didn't seem to be in a huge amount of crisis, other than having their king just die in battle. But he managed to avenge his father, and build some stuff in Gondor, and yeah, B tier king. Next is Ondoher, the Stone Lord, who was Kalimektar's son. He is interesting because he is the one that met with King Erephant of Arthedain. Arthedain was one of the 3 successor kingdoms to Arnor when it collapsed in like the 10th century of the Third Age. I think at some point I'll do a Kings of Arnor tier list, and we could talk more about Arthedain, excuse me. But Ondoher met with King Erephant, and they seem to recognize that the guys attacking their respective kingdoms might be linked, and that it might be linked to some kind of evil rising. So they decided to forge an alliance. And to secure this alliance, Ondoher sent his daughter Firiel to wed the Prince of Arthedain, Arvedui. Now this is important because Firiel and Arvedui, their children would lead to the chieftains of the Dunedain and eventually to Aragorn, Aragorn II. So he would have both Gondorian and Arnorian royal blood. So, Ondoher would later return to Gondor, and he would be attacked by Wain Riders and Haradrim. It was a two-pronged attack, presumably orchestrated by Sauron, which we know was the great evil that was coordinating these. And so, from the south and from the east, armies were sent to Gondor, and he split his army into two, and he committed the command of the eastern army to himself and his son, Artemir, while he left his younger son, Faramir, behind, in case, they died and the succession would be safe. And for the southern army, led by of the Haradrim, was faced by his nephew. Excuse me, not his nephew. His one of his kinsmen, Eärnil, would lead the attack against the Haradrim, coming up through Harandor across the river Poros. Unfortunately, Ondoher, sorry, I keep forgetting his name. Ondoher and his son Artemir are killed in battle by the Wain Riders, just like God, I'm having trouble remembering these names. Just like Narmakil was. Yeah, just like Narmakil was. So Ondoher and his son die, and it turns out that Faramir actually did not stay behind in Minas Anor. He decided to disguise himself and fight alongside his father and brother, I guess as a way of, having his honor. But he would be killed too in the battle. And then his nephew, Minochtar, would also be killed shortly thereafter, I think in a separate battle. So, just like that, the king is dead and 3 potential heirs are dead. And his reign was only 8 years, which is sad. This was... I think he is I think he's a B tier. Well, maybe a C tier, because he does get killed. And he also manages to get the next 3 heirs of his house killed, even if one wasn't intentional. And he's only kept out of D because he did secure that alliance with Arthedain that would later lead to Aragorn. So I'll give him points for that. But he's definitely a C tier king. After Ondoher, his kinsman, who was great-great-grandson of Telumechtar Umbardakil, is Eärnil, another sea lover, who led the forces of the southern army of Gondor, fought the Haradrim, defeated them, and then he goes to Ithilien and defeats the Wain Riders while they're in their camp at the so-called Battle of the Camp. So he manages to defeat both these enemies in a quick, speedy campaign, almost reminiscent of something like Subhartu, I think it was. Subatun, the Mongol guy who fought 2 battles in 500 miles apart in the span of a day or whatever, and won both crushingly. Maybe I got the numbers wrong, but probably a very capable field commander, managing to get his logistics up and running so he's able to fight these guys quickly. And he wins both times, and he defeats, for the time, the guys of the enemies of Gondor. Now, he's not king yet, but he returns to Gondor, and the Council of Gondor, which is probably the counselors of state, the various ministers, and the steward have to figure out what to do now. Who becomes the new king of Gondor? And Firiel or probably Arvedui, the now king of Arthedain, probably puts forth his wife, Firiel, who is the daughter of the previous king, and that she should be queen now, that Gondor is hers. This would have united, of course, Arthedain and Gondor. Of course, it wouldn't matter much because Arthedain would collapse soon afterwards, but the Council of Gondor and the Steward reject Firiel, probably for a couple reasons, if I had to guess. First of all, they cite it's because she's a woman, and according to Gondorian law, or according to Númenórean law, a woman can inherit the throne. But perhaps the elite of Gondor felt that the kingdom needed a war leader as its king, and a woman couldn't be a war leader, of course. There was probably also the matter of Firiel was a Gondorian, but she would be she was also the wife of an Arnorian, Arthedain king, and a North Dunedain, which I suppose the Gondorians felt were different after almost 2 millennia of distinction between the two, and didn't want to be beholden to these northern interests. Perhaps they didn't want to be saddled under that yoke like they had under Isildur and Elendil. Who knows? We don't know. That Tolkien didn't really write about too many reasons other than the fact that Firiel was a woman. But eventually the Council of Gondor and the Steward go with Eärnil, who becomes Eärnil II of Gondor. And afterwards, he later meets up with the Lindon Elves, probably with Elrond and Glorfindel and Círdan, all those cool guys, and he teams up with he teams up with them to save Arthedain. And unfortunately, by the time Eärnil gets to the north, Arthedain had already been destroyed by the Witch King of Angmar. But Eärnil doesn't go north. He sends his son Eärnur to go north. But of course, by the time Arthedain is gone, but Eärnur manages to destroy Angmar, the Witch King's realm of Angmar, along with the elves. And unfortunately, Eärnil also presides over the conquest of Minas Ithil by the Nazgul after the Witch King returns to Mordor. So Eärnil loses Minas Ithil and presumably the rest of Ithilien, and Minas Anor, with no Tower of the Moon to contrast it, just becomes Minas Tirith, the Tower Guard. And this is his reign. Presumably he is saddled with defending against probing attacks across the river for the next, several decades. And all said, Eärnil II rules for 98 years. 98 years. This, he might actually, he's definitely either S or A. I think he'd have to be A, because he manages to defeat the enemies of Gondor, and he succeeds to the throne. He sends forces to go defeat Angmar, and he succeeds. He is probably the last gasp of Gondorian greatness before Aragorn. And his only mark against him is he loses Minas Ithil, which I don't know what he could have done. But other than that, he seems to live a long, peaceful time. He has a strong reign. He is the conquering hero. He's an A tier. He's an A tier. Not quite an S tier. I think if he wanted to be an S tier, he would have had to defend Minas Ithil and maybe even save Arthedain, but he couldn't do it in time. Next is his son Eärnur, the sea servant or mariner, who is Eärnil's son. I think I already said that. He's the one, of course, he went to Angmar and fought in the north. He's the one to whom Glorfindel gave the prophecy that, here's the story. I believe Eärnur was challenged by the Witch King after he had defeated his armies to a single combat, and Eärnur rushed to him to fight the Witch King, but his horse got scared because it's the Witch King and ran away. The Witch King, kind of laughed at this, and Eärnur was humiliated. As the Witch King was running away, Eärnur tried to give chase, but Glorfindel cautioned him. Glorfindel the elf. He's not in the movies, but he was a servant for a long time of Rivendell, and he's cool because, according to some versions of the Legendarium, he was like one of the only elves to come back from the halls of Mandos, back to Middle-earth, like in a reincarnated body. He's pretty cool. But he cautions Eärnur and says that the Witch King will not die by the hands of man, or something like no man can kill him, or whatever. Like you've heard in the movie. It's kind of a prophecy because Eowyn will later kill the Witch King. But Eärnur later goes back, and at the death of his father, he becomes king. And shortly after he becomes king, the Witch King issues a challenge to him. Come fight me again. And I think he ignores the first time. But the second challenge comes 7 years later. And he accepts the second challenge. And he goes along with some of his knights and rides to Minas Morgul to fight the Witch King. And he never returns. Never returns. And he's lost. He's very likely he was killed by the Witch King, but because no one knows that, he's not technically dead in the eyes of, like, I guess the Gondorian law or whatever. He's just missing. And in the meantime, until the king returns, the stewards will be in charge of the kingdom. And this kind of mythology, I guess, rises up that the stewards will give back the rule of Gondor once the king has returned. Of course, a generation passes, and even if Eärnur hadn't been killed in Minas Morgul, which he very likely was, he would have just died of old age. But, you know, there's no king, and Gondor is really afraid of another incident like the Kinstrife, so they're just, let's just have the stewards reign in the meantime. And of course the stewards eventually just become effectively kings. They're the kings in all but name, and Denethor, by the time of the Lord of the Rings, is quite content to have that remain the way. Eärnur, unfortunately, of course, had no heir, he had no children, and that is always going to be a strike against. His actions were haughty. He did not die in battle like some of these others. He went rashly to go fight the Witch King because his pride had been wounded, and he was lost. So he did deeds as, you know, the prince in the north, but that is not really what I guess I really haven't had opportunity to judge the actions of a prince. At least I haven't framed it that way. So I think I will, because I think I did that for Valakar and who was the other guy? Minalcar, as he was regent. Not Minalcar. Yeah, Minalcar was regent, and Valakar, who wed the woman when he was a prince, which I judged him for that. So I'm definitely going to judge Eärnur. He is C tier. He's only C tier because of his exploits in the north. As king, he gave in to the challenge and was lost and died with no heir. He would be D otherwise. But he did defeat the Witch King the first time. Or at least his army, not specifically him. Next, I mean, come on. Next is Aragorn, King Elisar Telcontar, the Elfstone, whose last name is Strider. That's the name of his new house. Of course, he is a descendant of Furiel and Arvedui. He becomes chieftain of the Dunedain when he's like 2 when his dad dies. Arathorn the second, Aragorn, son of Arathorn. He did all kinds of stuff in his youth. He fought for Gondor and Rohan. He rode with King Thingol. He served Ecthelion II, Denethor's father. He traveled both the east and the south. He hunted down Gollum after Gandalf was afraid the One Ring had been found. He led the Fellowship. He led Gimli and Legolas. He to rescue Pippin and Merry. He goes through the halls of the dead. He leads forces at the Battle of Pelennor Fields. He leads forces at the Battle of the Black Gates. And he presides over the destruction of the One Ring. He is like one of the greatest heroes at the end of the Third Age. And once he becomes King of Gondor, he restores the kingdom of Arnor, which had fallen 2,000 years before. He restores the High Kingdom, He becomes the new High King. He plants a new tree in Minas Tirith, a new white tree. And he makes alliances and deals with the Ents, the Druidine, the Wozes, the little people that dwell in the forest of Rohan, and the Shire. And he expands he fights wars and expands the kingdom into Rhûn and Harad, probably bringing Gondor back to its greatest extent under who was that, Romendikil the First. And he has a reign of 122 years as king. Before then, he had, but if you count his time as chieftain, it was 208 years, which is almost his entire life. He's just ruler. He's in charge. He's always doing something. Aragorn is awesome, and as King Elisar, he's an S. There's no question about it. He's an S tier king, best king since Romendikil the First. Yeah, S, no question about it. And next is Eldarion, his son by Arwen. And Eldarion, whose name means something like Elven Son, is half-elven, though it's not really explained what this all means. In the first age, half-elvens had they had like a choice between being elf or man. It's not entirely clear if Eldarion would have had this choice, because he lives in the fourth age, and the fourth age is different than the first age, so to speak. There's really not much recorded about his reign, other than it was just great. I think in a letter Tolkien wrote that his reign was, it was great. It was good. And he reigns for about 100 years. The New Shadow, which is the sequel story that Tolkien abandoned because he wasn't feeling it, is apparently takes place. It's like 122 years after Aragorn's reign, so it'll be a little after Eldarion's reign too. So Eldarion doesn't have the responsibility of dealing with that. We don't know who succeeds Eldarion. We know he has a few sisters, and presumably he might have had a wife and children. It's just not written because it's beyond the scope of what Tolkien was interested in. But Eldarion's gonna get an A. He reigns great, probably steers the ship. We don't know what he really does, but yeah, he's a tier. So there we have it. All the Kings of Gondor ranked according to various criteria and discussed. And this video is a little long, isn't it? Yeah, but I hope you had a good time. Yeah, we only got 3 S tier guys, which is fittingly so. We have an F tier, Castamere. Castamere is the worst. Most of them fall between A and C. Most of them are actually B tier, which is fine. It's a bell curve, right? And again, we're constrained by the fact that we just don't know much about these people. But I hope you had fun, and if you have any comments or about my rankings, or if you think your rankings would be different, I'd love to hear you talk about it. So let me know in the comments below. I love Tolkien. I love talking about this kind of stuff. I think I might even make a Kings of Arnor tier list if you guys like this, and I think that would be fun. There's less kings also. I ranked 36 people here, and that took a while, but we'll see. Until next time, thank you so much for watching, and take care. All right, bye.